We must apologize beforehand, but we are going to interrupt the regularly scheduled program to bring you a break from all the war propaganda that you get from all the networks to talk about a very important subject this evening on Irrespective. I know some of you are sad that we're not continuing with some of our commentary, debunking the lies that are being told surrounding how the Bible supports this entire thing. And we understand. We ourselves, frankly, also get tired of all of the propagandization that we're constantly exposed to. So we said, if we need a repose from all of this, I think our audience also needs a repose from all of this incessant coverage over what's happening in the Middle East to talk about the other things that are important in the matter. And that's why we are bringing you this subject this evening. Came across a clip on social media that we found interesting and wanted to comment on, and that is what we are going to do on this evening's edition of Irrespective. Did Christianity go against the norm, being polygamy, establishing a new norm, monogamy? This is the argument that a British author and cultural commentator is making, and we're going to tackle it head on. Not that we necessarily, we'll get into the minutia in just a few moments, disagree with her assertion, but there are certain things that need to be elucidated on so as to be correct, not only historically, but biblically on the matter, and also the intention behind the message. More on that shortly. Welcome each and every one of you to this new live stream. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Gio, and this is my co-host, Jesus.
Good evening, friends. Thanks. It's elucidated and not hallucinations, because a lot of people, I believe, when they make comments on a topic such as this, you are wondering, once you listen to them, are they high on something? And so we're going to be talking about players. We are going to be talking about players. And it seems like it's making a comeback. And according to this author and this commentator, which, by the way, she does defend Christianity and all the benefit that it has brought to society. According to her, this is talking about the players: 1 man, 3 women; 1 man, 4 women; 1 woman, 3 men. Because now, in the modern time, it takes different roles now, and different forms. It seems like it's making a comeback. So I guess it's something that we need to tackle, because if less and less people are going to church and more people are in tune to what the world is saying, to what the popular trends are, then you must be careful out there with your son and your daughter, sons and or daughters, because maybe this is stuff that they're listening to and that they are inclined to embrace, because since people no longer follow Christ, or they have decided not to follow Christ, maybe this is something that is seeping into their thought life.
Yes. More on that shortly. First and foremost, as always, we have to do some housekeeping here. If you have not yet subscribed, we encourage you to do so, whether you're watching this on X, Rumble, or YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube and Rumble, please hit the notification bell to be alerted as to when we go live. We live stream every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we're doing right now, and Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, smash that like button and share our content with others. If you'd like to interact with us, please do so through Rumble and through YouTube by placing your question or comment in the chat. Do not forget to follow us on TikTok. The username is on the screen, at The Irrespective. You can also follow us on X at Irrespective77. And last but not least, do not forget to donate. It helps us to continue to put out this content for your edification. We exist to challenge conventional Christianity. That is our motto. For those of you that have been watching our episodes for some time now, we've been receiving messages saying this is very refreshing. Thank you for the topics that you're covering in a frank manner, away from this, shall we call it, religious zealotry and appearance making that is very common amongst these circles. And we thank you for those comments. That is part of our motto here. But again, we need your help financially to continue to publish this content for your edification. There's a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that you can scan. Conversely, there is a link that you can click on underneath the video player in the description box to be taken to PayPal services, where those donations and patronages are processed. Now, we'd like to introduce the subject matter for this evening, a Louise Perry. Louise M. Perry from Wikipedia. She is a British journalist, author, and podcast host. She is a featured writer for the Daily Mail and a columnist at the New Statesman, and has been described as a leading reactionary feminist. Although we've seen a couple of her content, she doesn't identify herself as necessarily being feminist, more so an anti-feminist in a sense. She's even more recently said that she has converted to Christianity, coming from a more secular viewpoint, from seeing the advantages that Christianity confers upon humanity. More on that shortly. Perry Cole runs the charity We Can't Consent to This, which campaigns around problems with the rough sex murder defense. Won't get into that now. She is the co-founder and research director of The Other Half, a nonpartisan feminist think tank, which was founded in 2022. She is the host of the podcast Maiden Mother Matriarch. Now, she has appeared in Oxford Union's debates, and she's been pretty much ostracized repeatedly by feminists in Great Britain and the United States for her anti-feminist stance. And one of her recent books, she actually argues that polygamy, being the norm for much of history, was actually displaced, others would use the term replaced, by Christianity and what it preaches, monogamy. Now, if you're going to look at it from the vantage point of, let's call it Darwinian ethics, if it is such a thing, but I've heard atheists use that phrase before, they look at everything through a very secularist lens, absent the Christian ethic in all of this. So it would make sense, in a sense, that a person who sees the world through that lens would then say, I'm just going to look at the way that humans have interacted up until now, especially if you're just going to take a secular viewpoint on the matter. Now, being Christians, especially those of us that have read the Bible, you'll note that from Genesis, it actually says something completely different. And I think it's important to lay this as a groundwork for what we're about to hear, because there are Christians that are going to hear what she's going to say and say, wait a minute, but in Genesis, from the very beginning, what God establishes is monogamy. However, you can't argue with the historical record that even in the Bible, in the Old Testament, polygamy was a thing, and Christians do have to contend with the fact that it doesn't seem to appear that from the law on, as it were, there was, and even before then with some other patriarchs, doesn't seem like God necessarily has an issue with polygamy, again, constrained within the context of the Old Testament.
One of the things that I was asked over and over and over again when I was doing pastoral work from a local pulpit, let's call that, was the following: how come you hardly preach from the Old Testament? And it's true. Very rarely did I preach from the Old Testament. Well, number one is I don't live under that covenant. Number two, there are issues that unless the people that are asking the questions are willing to give you the time for you to explain these things, then what you are doing is starting arguments and debates and getting into never-ending arguments. Paul goes even into the issue of genealogies and things that supposedly the law says that people that are not well trained in it, they actually twist and create arguments and dissension. So for those reasons that I have mentioned and more, I mostly stayed away from the Old Testament. Of course, somebody would ask, but how can you teach balanced Christianity without the Old Testament? Easily. You pay attention to what Jesus said, the corrections that Paul brought in, because as Gentiles, we have certain tendencies that Paul, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, corrected, and you can teach proper Bible, proper covenant theology by sticking mostly to the New Testament. This does not mean that I have spent zero time or very little time in the Old Testament. I just opted not to spend all my time or pulpit time tackling with issues of the Old Testament. Today, we are tackling one of the issues that you, Gio, myself, all of us, we need to face the reality that in the Old Testament, it's not that God put a seal of approval on polygamy, but it seems like he tolerated it.
Right.
And you can start with Abraham. He had a couple of ladies uh, in his bed. You can take a look at Jacob.
Correct.
He had about four in his bed.
Yep.
And then you move into the law and you ask yourself, how many women did David have?
Right.
And then if you talk about Solomon,
The record breaker.
only Wilt Chamberlain could beat him, according to Wilt's own record keeping. So there are issues there that, if you want to look at it as God tolerated it or approved it, that's fine. That's your way of looking at it. But I enjoyed the way this author framed it, because she never said the Judeo-Christian ethic brought about monogamy. She placed it where it should be placed, at the feet of Christianity. If she would have said the Judeo-Christian ethic
we got a
brought
problem.
about monogamy, I would immediately discard whatever she has to say from the theological point of view, because I would say she is mistaken.
Let me address this before we continue, because there are people who will listen to what we are saying and they interpret it as something else. This is part and parcel of this generation that wants to hear what it thinks it wants to hear and not what the person or people are saying. Number one, we are not endorsing polygamy. When you hear Luis Perry or us talk about how historically this was a norm, that doesn't mean that we are approving of it. We're just making an observation based on the historical evidence and data. That's number one. Number two, when we use the phrase that it appears as if God tolerated it, this arrangement, as it were, in the Old Testament, immediately what comes to mind to most Christians, but they won't express it out of fear, is now all of a sudden I'm in a conundrum, because this is one of those things that leads me to believe that there is a contradiction in God and what God commands in one generation versus another. But you'll notice that I kicked it back to Genesis, that we're kicking it back to Genesis, because it's important to lay the groundwork. The original design for mankind, according to what God tells us in Genesis through Moses writing the book of Genesis, is one man and one woman. But also you bring up an important point, and this is the third thing that we need to examine in all of this. Context is important. We're not going to play that game where everything has to be explained in a minute for a person to be informed. We're not going to engage in those tactics, because there are things that are necessarily complex, where in order to understand the essence of the truth, you have to follow that thread and follow it carefully to arrive at the epicenter. And sometimes those explanations cannot be given in a minute. So is also the case with this topic. So wanted to say those three things to lay as a groundwork and foundation for what else is going to be said here. But let's go ahead and play the clip, and then we will comment.
Our species norm is polygamy, where you have 80% of cultures on the anthropological record have been polygynous, where you have high status men have multiple wives and low status men have no wives. Christianity is unusual in insisting on monogamy. We inherited it from Rome. It was a very important component of 2,000 years of Christian civilization, which now, of course, we're mostly rejected. And even though legally you're still only allowed to marry one person, having sex outside of marriage is now completely socially permissible, and so people are in practice being drawn back towards our species norm, having lifted the monogamous restriction. But I argue in the book, and I think really strongly, that monogamous restriction produces much better outcomes, particularly for women and for low status men. But there are all sorts of ways in which monogamous cultures do better than polygynous cultures. Lower crime rates, lower domestic violence rates, less economic inequality, all sorts of good outcomes that come with insisting on.
Now, she makes quite a few good points, and we'll point out a couple of things here that need to be pointed out. But let me say this before we continue. I'd like to get your thoughts on this. One of the things that I'm reading from the comments that were placed on this video and in other social media aspects, because they didn't just place this clip on YouTube, it's placed elsewhere. Addressing the elephant in the room of, again, people hearing what they want to hear. They're accusing Miss Perry of saying something that she didn't say, where she is, in essence, mind you, her own argumentation proves that she's not saying that she's endorsing polygamy. And I'll get into I would guess to say even a necessity to actually make an argument from a secularist standpoint. And I know that sounds contradictory, but I'll get to it in just a second. I think she's very smart in approaching it from this vantage point also, because there has to be something said for different lines of argumentation in order to convince a person to abandon a flawed position and arrive at the correct one. It doesn't have to be exclusively, as it were, if you're trying to guide a person into truth, it doesn't have to be exclusively like a lot of Christians have been trained. It has to be through the presentation of the gospel. There's multiple ways to get to a presentation of the gospel where it's not explicitly just a presentation of the gospel or of gospel ethics. That's a fallacy that I will never subscribe to, because we even see that in the person of Christ and in the work of the apostles. So more on that maybe in a future episode. But one thing that I've noticed that a lot of people, that instead of listening to her argumentation, they did the very same thing that we warned against. They're saying, oh, so in a sense, she's actually arguing, she's leaving the door open for people to argue. Well, look, she herself is admitting, even though she's against it in a sense, that polygamy was the norm. And that kind of gives the evidence to the opposing side that actually argues in favor of that. And I think that's just the wrong-headed way of approaching what she's actually trying to say.
Just because you recognize that a particular evil had domain or control over society doesn't mean you are endorsing that, most especially when she brings up Christianity and how it brought about a fix to the problem. She mentions a couple of things that I find out very interesting. She explains that Christianity gave women a proper place. Because if you were a man of status, she explains, you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 women. If you were not a man of status, you might not get a wife at all. And so if you were a woman back then, or so when you were living back then, maybe you had to make a choice, or maybe a choice was made for you. I'd rather my daughter be with this guy who's going to have 4 wives than with an individual who can offer her no future.
Right.
There's many different scenarios that you can play out as to why we had this situation that history shows that this was the way it was. And so for women, it gives them a point of stability. One woman, one man. And so there is no competition. That's the way that God designed it. It's interesting because one of the books that sold a lot in recent past was something titled Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And somebody kept cracking jokes about if one man has one wife and she is difficult enough, and we're not even talking about the sexual issues, the fact that we've been called simpletons and very simple people. We just need a couple of things and we're happy, while women are supposedly very complex and very difficult to please. So the joke went something like, if one woman is difficult enough for a man, imagine 5 or 6. So
Right.
These are some of the things that were tossed around in this interview that, again, she gives credit where credit is due. Christianity certainly established the advantages of monogamy. It sets the woman in her proper place, and I'm not talking about correcting women. I'm talking about giving her this place of dignity, this place of respect that she should have, and not to share her place with another 5 women or 3 women. There's a principle behind this that I want to tackle with you, if you will allow me a couple of minutes, Jill, that I think needs to be considered. Let's just say that since today's generation, Christians of today's generation are saying, I don't see a problem if 2 men love themselves or each other. They should be married, and they argue things like this. And you go like, this is a Christian arguing on behalf of homosexual marriage, gay marriage, and lo and behold, you hear Christians arguing on behalf of gay marriage. So it wouldn't surprise me that we get a faction of Christianity that says, hey, polygamy is fine. Like there's a fraction of Christianity that not only endorses pornography, but they actually tell you, hey, go ahead and try this. This will be good for your marriage. So there's a little bit of everything supposedly in the body of Christ. If they're in the body or not, I'll leave that up to your judgment. But anyway, these are arguments that are out there, and you never know who's that Christian next to you that one of these days he or she will surprise you and say, I believe in that. Even the Mormons in this country, where it's illegal to have two wives, there are factions of the Mormons. There are groups out there that are saying, no, we like the way Smith had it, and we want to continue this way.
Yep.
Here's the, I believe it's a principle that helps this author establish her point, even though she did not use it. Jesus said, if you have two masters, Joe, you will love one and you will hate the other.
Can't have dual loyalty. It's impossible.
Exactly. So can one man love 5, 10 women equally?
It's not going to happen. I mean, even I'll give you one of the most classic examples from the Old Testament. We have this situation of this woman whom she is married to this just man, as I guess the Bible calls him, a righteous man, but she can't bear a child. We're talking about Samuel's mother. But it seems like the text indicates almost as if even though the other woman had children, he actually favored, as it were, this woman. So to your point, even in a polygamous relationship, there seems to be a, hate to use the term, but like a favoritism of sorts.
Jacob had
Right.
certain issues in that a particular avenue that you are describing.
Yeah.
So I know what the counter argument will be. Well, if a couple has 10 kids, they love them all equally. Different scenario, completely different. Please, let's keep the topic or the comparisons apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Can a man actually say, I can equally love these 10 women?
It doesn't seem, you can use even other examples, a Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, whatever you want to call it. Plenty of examples in the Bible where you see that there seems to be that favored person in that arrangement.
So why would you set up a situation where that is about to happen? And this is why she argues when you have polygamy, you have the wife beatings,
right?
And you have different things that go on within those relationships, the envy, the strife, etc. I had a kid with this one. You don't get to tell my kid how to run his affairs because this is not your kid. I mean, you are just setting yourself up for a mess of issues, big time. But I'll say it one more time. For some of you that are listening or viewing this, you're going to say, like, what a silly topic to bring to believers. Well, that's what we would have said 50 years ago when some people are having conversations about gay marriage, 30 years ago about homosexual marriage. And yet here we are.
This is part of the culture war.
Some Christians arguing on behalf of that.
Oh, there you go. Let me also bring this up for those of you that are more theologically inclined, where you might say, where's the argumentation in favor of this in a biblicist fashion? Well, think about this. If you're going to, and this is going to tie into a point that I told the audience that I would make, and I'll make it here, making sure that I tie this in a nice knot for the audience. If we're going to argue this from, let's call it the Christian angle or the gospel angle, we find that the illustrative language that the New Testament uses, Paul, for example, talks about Christ and his bride, not Christ and his brides, plural, singular instead, Christ and his bride. Not only that, when Paul, Peter, the Bible in the New Testament talks to us about what marriage is supposed to reflect, one of the things that comes out from these writers is Christ's faithfulness. And that has to be reflected in marriage, kicking it back all the way to before the law was established. I'll give you a bit of a breadcrumb here that you can follow in your own time to understand why perhaps there is an explanation for why God tolerated, and that's the word that we'll use here, the operative word here in the Old Testament. But you made a great point earlier. I'm not going to sit here and give you a defense, as it were, of the Judeo custom. I'm not a Judean. He's not a Judean. We're Christians. So guess what? We defend the gospel, not the law. We're not part of that. We don't choose to identify with that because the Bible tells us that we are new creations in Christ. So the Pragers of life and the Levins of life, you can just go ahead and take your seats again and not listen to those guys. But anyways, the point is, you'll notice that there is an image there that the New Testament portrays for us in that faithfulness, which reflects back to something Jesus says in Matthew 19. Have you not heard that in the beginning God created them male and female, one and one, not multiple? You go back to Genesis, Adam and Eve. It's clearly delineated. However, in the Old Testament, there seems to be a permissiveness for it, for some would say reasons of, let's say, expanding. Some would say the Jewish nation or population, or simply the population of the earth. There are people who have made that argument, but they say it was good for that context and that time, that God tolerated it, but no more. Again, we can get into the weeds of that. We'll probably do that in a, perhaps we'll bring that up in a future episode. But now to the other side of this, as I said earlier, I'm glad she takes up this argument, looking at it from the vantage point of distancing necessarily Christianity for a second, or putting it aside, the argumentation on the side, and saying, by all metrics of observable evidence, monogamy is better. So she's being very wise, I believe, as a Christian, as I've heard her say that she has become, that now she is actually endorsing the Christian position and demonstrating that the Christian position not only is something that we should accept because God said so, but the evidence also directly tells you, it leads back to, in a sense, give you validation for what God is already telling you
It's
should be the
orderly and
order.
it brings order. Whereas with the other scenario, you're inviting chaos.
Yep.
And you are inviting a situation where rules really cannot play any significant role in those relationships, if you dare call those things relationships. Furthermore, I believe it's mostly physical, or maybe in some cases people will argue it's financial, because if there's 5 of us bringing in a check, then we can make things better for all 5 of us. That's a silly argument, because in this generation where we have gotten used to having 3, 4 television sets, 2, 3 automobiles, a couple of homes, all it takes to run a tighter ship financially is a few adjustments, especially we who live in the States, and we will be okay. So as you start looking at all the excuses that people make to sort of kind of give an approval to things that the Bible, the New Testament, Christianity denounces, you see how those arguments fall apart. And it's the same with polygamy. How many relationships can you point to where polygamy is at the center? Can you say, yeah, this worked out really well, and the vast majority of the people involved in it are really happy, to the point that you can test them, you can examine them and say, this brings fulfillment like monogamy cannot bring?
Yes.
You're not going to find that.
And here's another point that I'd like to leave with the audience, because these conversations are always very interesting for us, because it gets into the philosophy behind why, when Christianity advocates for these things, commands these things, it is necessary for us to follow them for our own flourishing, to reflect God's design, the best design for us, et cetera, et cetera. But here's an important point. One of the things that I like that she does is that she frames, what do they call it? Hookup culture nowadays. She frames it as a form of polygamy. Some people, I noticed in the comments section of the videos where this was posted, they said, how can you classify hookup culture as polygamy? Well, just because you don't sign on the dotted line on a marriage certificate with various women or various men, whatever the arrangement may be.
It's illegal here.
Right.
It's illegal. People have to fly under the radar to
Right.
do certain things.
But
Plus, if you can get away with the pleasures, if you will, without the
There
obligations,
you
then
go.
people are going to sign up for that.
there you go. And that leads to a litany of problems, because if you don't have the
Absolutely.
obligation, then you have the children out of wedlock, the parents and the fathers and the mothers who are not present, that they abandon their children, they abuse their children, et cetera, et cetera.
One of them
et
is
cetera.
jealous, takes up a gun, and decides to end the other relationship. There's just so much that can go wrong. Just absolutely a lot that can.
Yep.
And if it can go wrong, then it typically tends to go wrong at one point or another.
I think we don't want to make this edition too long in the tooth, but I think we've given the audience enough, if you want to call them bullet points. And I think she's done a fantastic job of giving you also the bullet points necessary to demonstrate that these are necessarily truths that you need to hold on to, not only for the protection of yourself against the temptations toward what she is calling the modern arrangement, reverting back to the historical norm, which obviously Christianity does away with, thankfully. But you brought up this earlier point. We'll bring topics such as these, and people will say conceptually, great episode. But I find it interesting that when we talk about these things, we also tell people, internalize these things. so that they will be guideposts for your existence and also to help others out of the darkness that they're in. So my last encouragement in this episode were to be, when we bring topics like these, whenever we talk about these issues, make sure to internalize them, because again, we don't want to be that forgetful listener that James talks about, where you look at yourself in the mirror and then you kind of forget how you look and you have to keep going back to the mirror. Internalize these things for your own protection against the temptations that are out there, and also help others get out of that.
So let's just say one guy has 3 wives, common law marriage is going to kick in at one point or another.
Yep.
And 2 of them say, we want out.
Right.
How do you divide the goods now?
That is what they call an old-fashioned conundrum.
And how about the visiting rights if there are kids involved?
Correct.
I mean, you can see the chaos that this brings. And yet, if I were to ask my brother, my sister to take something away from what we are covering tonight, it's not the fact that you and I know that monogamy is the way to go. This is what Christianity teaches. I'll say it again, Christianity. If you get into the Old Testament, just make sure you're able to explain certain situations like you and I were pointing out. Otherwise, you're going to be left in ridicule. But monogamy is a Christian idea, something that Christianity takes from the sayings of God himself, from the Father and the Son, and places it in place. And if you were to take something from tonight, it's not something that you already know. It's the warning, it's the admonishment that crazy ideas, when you first start to sound them off, you'll go, that will never be an issue in the body of Christ until it is.
Yes.
So my last word of admonishment, my advice is, pay attention to these things, because I believe she is correct when she says there's more of this happening than meets the eye.
Yes.
Of course, they can't go and get a marriage license. They're going to be in trouble.
But there are people pushing for it to legalize it again.
They still fly under the radar, and you still can get issues, Gio, like I just mentioned, where you have one guy, 5 women, or vice versa. All of a sudden you have common law marriage, because they can all prove, hey, we've been living like husband and wives for the last 5 years, and now 2 want out, 3 want out, another one wants in. I mean, there's just chaos waiting to come in and do what it does.
Folks, we would like to let our audience know to tune in on Sunday. We have let's call it a particularly nice edition for you on Sunday. There's a pretty famous commentator amongst conservative circles that has now taken a shot at another conservative commentator. And you might be thinking, yeah, what else is new? The so-called podcast wars. We're not interested in the back and forth, the personal back and forth that these people might have with each other, with reach and what they call each other. That's not our interest. Vain things. What we will get into is something that one of these hosts said, because it touches on the Christian ethical side of things. And we're going to ask the question, if Christians are concerned above anything else of their own, are they committing a grave sin? I'll give you a hint. You've probably already seen the clips because it went viral today. Dennis Prager, whom is paralyzed, he is the interviewee from the former CEO of the Daily Wire, Jeremy Boring. Apt last name, if you ask us. And he went off on podcast host Tucker Carlson, in which he says, this man has said that he is America only. This is just, I can't understand why a man who calls himself a Christian would say such a thing. Now, again, you might think, oh, but he's relegating this to the political realm. We ask you to look behind what's propelling that comment, because behind it, I believe, I'd like to get your thoughts on it, I believe that there is subversion of the highest order against what Christianity actually calls us to with respect to loyalty.
Well, first of all, the topic that is proposed by most conservative thinkers is not American only, it's American first. And I can go to the New Testament and quote Paul, where he says, if you have the opportunity to do well, do the right thing for many people, go ahead and do it. But most especially, do it for the family of God. So even there, we pick up on the fact that if I have a buck and I have to, split that, I'm going to go 80-20. 70-30. I'm not going to go 50-50 because I have the New Testament permission to say I can favor my own.
Exactly. So we are going to ask the question, are Christians, do they need to be loyal to everyone and everything? I think the answer will surprise you. So Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we hope that you will join us then. Once again, do remember to subscribe if you have not done so yet, whether you're watching this through X, YouTube, or Rumble. If you're on YouTube or Rumble, hit the notification bell to be alerted as to when we go live. Next, as I said, Wednesdays, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sundays, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Do not forget to smash that like button and share our content with others. Do not forget to donate. There's a QR code. It's been standing on there. Pretty, you can say that it's a manly QR code that stays up there because it's been up there for a while. He just doesn't move from his post. We would dare argue that our QR code actually stands at guard a lot better than the Queen's, or actually in this case, the King's guard stand in front of Buckingham Palace. It's been there all this time. Scan it. There's also a code that you can, a link that you can click on beneath in the description box. Last but not least, follow us on X at Irrespective77 and on TikTok at The Irrespective.
One more thing, Gio, if I may. If you are a man, if you are under 42, Uncle Sam might just want you.
Yep.
This is the latest from the Department of War.
Yes. One wonders why the subtle and sudden change to the limit for recruitment. Some people are thinking that they might be taking the exit soon enough because this war might be claiming more lives than what people are thinking.
So just when people are saying, I've had enough of the conversations about this, that, and the other thing, now all of a sudden, all of you who are under 42, you have something else to think about.
That is correct. That's all the time we have left for this edition. Thank you for those of you that watched the entirety of the episode. For Jesus, this has been Gio. Godspeed.